It was a time to reflect on one of the most dramatic moments in post-war history.
Здравствуй, милая Светланочка.
My darling Svetlana, I write letters to you almost every day, but cannot receive any reply from you. It may be that you have not received any of the 7 letters I've already sent you. But that's all right. I'm not losing hope.
In October 1956, Mykola Kubikov was 23, a junior officer in the Soviet army. His wife Svetlana was just 19 and 6 months pregnant when he was called up. Only on board the military plane did he discover where he was going: Hungary.
I had no idea what I could write to him, where he was, what had happened to him. His military unit could not tell me anything. You can imagine how much I suffered.
Volodymyr Taranenko was also heading for Hungary, overland, in a column of tanks. But he didn't know why.
We crossed the border before dawn and drove through sleeping villages. We stopped for a smoke and got talking to an old bloke on a bicycle. He asked us where we were going. No idea, we said. Haven't you heard, he asked? There's a revolution going on in Budapest. It was the first we'd heard of it.
It had all begun with a peaceful march to Bem Square on the 23rd of October. The demands were simple: more freedom of expression, more democracy.
I was one of the many students here in the square. The soldiers at the windows began tearing the stars off their caps and throwing them down into the street. It was raining stars. Then I saw a soldier take a knife and cut out the communist emblem from the center of the Hungarian flag. That was when I realized this is more than a demonstration. This is a revolution.
Students and workers formed armed groups. Soviet tanks and armored cars entered Budapest and met unexpected resistance. The soldiers had no experience of urban warfare. Casualties on both sides were high.
At the sight of all the dead, I lost my fear. We jumped onto the nearest Soviet tank and hammered on the roof until a young soldier poked his head out. When we showed him the bodies, women with shopping baskets, children going to school, he wept. The tank came over to our side, and we rode on it to Parliament.
There, Soviet tank crews fraternized with the crowd. But then the shooting started.
On the 25th, there was a tremendous bloodshed. Soviet tanks shot an unarmed demonstration at the Parliament Square. At least 200 dead bodies lay there, all unarmed, peaceful demonstrators. The nation was outraged, in addition to the political desire to be free.
The demands of the insurgents radicalized. The reform communist Imre Nagy, swept to power by the revolution, now sat uncomfortably at its head. On the 28th of October, the Soviet army staged a tactical retreat from Budapest. While the revolution in Hungary was gaining ground, inside the Kremlin here in Moscow, Nikita Khrushchev was hesitating. He was keen to rid his country of the worst excesses of his predecessor, Joseph Stalin. But how far would he dare go? What would happen if he allowed Hungary to escape the Soviet embrace? At an extraordinary meeting of the politburo on the 30th of October, a decision had to be made. Remarkable handwritten notes from that meeting show just how close the Soviet Union came to letting Hungary go. "We should adopt a declaration today," Khrushchev said, "on the withdrawal of troops from the countries of people's democracy." The comrades almost queued up to confess past mistakes. We must criticize ourselves, but justly. Anti-Soviet sentiments are widespread. Eliminate the elements of diktat. We should withdraw troops, if necessary, from Hungary as a whole. The declaration was unanimous and looked set to change the history of the Cold War.
The Soviet declaration on the 30th stated clearly that new principles should be established in relations between the socialist countries. It would have enabled a peaceful solution to the Hungarian crisis. That's why that day was so important.
Barely was the ink dry on the document than Khrushchev had second thoughts.
In his memoirs, Khrushchev wrote that he had a sleepless night. He came to the conclusion that they had made a bad decision.
Next morning, Khrushchev reconvened the politburo and proposed force rather than freedom. Again, the decision was unanimous.
Khrushchev could fear that if concessions given to Hungary turned to a catastrophe from the point of view of the Soviet Union, he would be considered as responsible of this catastrophic evolution.
Another factor was the Suez Crisis. Britain, which Khrushchev had visited only 6 months earlier, and France were stepping up their military actions against Egypt, a Soviet ally. Khrushchev was increasingly alarmed that the Soviet Union might lose both Egypt and Hungary. That would destroy Soviet prestige and undermine his own power. And that fear tipped the balance towards hammering Hungary. Khrushchev's special envoy to Budapest, Anastas Mikoyan, had fought hard for a peaceful solution in Hungary. Sensing a change of heart in the Kremlin, he'd flown back to Moscow.
He went straight from the airport to meet Khrushchev. Unfortunately, Khrushchev told him that the decision had been taken and the arguments of my father were considered wrong, and the only way out was to crush the uprising. The commands to the army had been given. In any case, now it was too late to change anything. After that, he straight from Khrushchev, he came to his dacha, where all of us, the family, were waiting for him, and we discovered that he was very much distressed and shocked.
Bela Kirai was a senior army officer asked by the Prime Minister to take charge of the revolutionaries. He had barely started when the Soviet invasion began.
I called up in Ranaj and reported to him, the situation changed. Now we are in war. The freedom fighters have the right to know that we are in war. I cordially propose that you declare that there is a state of war exists between the Soviet Union and Hungary.
Attention, attention. Imre Nagy speaking. In the early hours of the morning, Soviet troops have started an attack against the Hungarian capital with the apparent purpose of overthrowing the lawful democratic government of the country. Our troops are engaged in battle with the Soviet forces.
Значит, 4 ноября
We entered the city on the 4th of November at top speed. We were shot at immediately from all sides, from windows and balconies. We received the order to open fire on the city center around the Corvin cinema. At first, I was afraid. Then we got used to it. We even took our helmets off.
But back in the Soviet Union, Mykola's wife, Svetlana, pregnant with twins, received terrible news. Her husband, she was told, had fallen in battle.
That was the end of everything. I felt unwell and they took me to hospital at night. I went into labor. At 8 in the morning, I gave birth to a little girl and a little boy.
On that same day, the first letter from her husband arrived. then another, and the truth slowly dawned on her. Her husband had survived, but her children might not.
Within a week, the babies died, one after the other. My father made a little coffin and took them and buried them. It would have been easy for me to be cut into pieces and endure that suffering in my soul.
Hungarian resistance to the Soviet invasion crumbled rapidly. Imre Nagy and his government took refuge in the Yugoslav embassy in Budapest. Fighting continued for a few days elsewhere in the country.
The Hungarians opened fire on our column. One soldier was wounded, none were killed. We returned fire and most of them fled, but 2 of them surrendered. Later on, the order was issued to kill the captives. They were young, only 18 or 19. One of our soldiers ordered them to start walking up the hill, and then he shot them in the back.
The Hungarian Revolution was crushed, and in an act of calculated revenge, its leaders like Prime Minister Imre Nagy and its foot soldiers were tried, executed and buried here in unmarked graves. When I first came here in the mid-1980s, I used to climb in over that wall over there. Now, this is a shrine to the memory of 1956. The uprising was defeated, but it proved a hollow victory for the Soviet Union. World communism was dealt a blow from which it never recovered.
When the empire collapsed and the ideology of the Communist Party fell apart, we understood that the fatal blow had been dealt in October 1956 in Hungary.
Lev Krasnopevtsev was a history student at Moscow University who actively supported the Hungarian Revolution. For that, he served 10 years in prison.
I never regretted what happened, never that I chose such a path. I will always be grateful to the Hungarian Democrats who inspired us to make our stand, to stop wavering and wondering and act instead. And for all of us, Hungary was invaluable.
During the decades after the revolution, its memory was diluted and polluted, but never quite lost. Today, in a country where democracy is a reality, the legacy of 1956 is divisive. Some say its aims have been fulfilled, others that they've been betrayed. The documents prove that Hungary came closer to freedom 50 years ago than anyone ever realized. If it had, how different the world might have been.
Nick Thorpe, let's have a quick look now at Saturday morning's